everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thanks for coming to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Penny Noss, and I lead our programs on strategic competitiveness here at the German Marshall Fund. So before all the fun of next week, where I think we're all going to be very, very busy, we thought we'd do a kind of a more informational event today about the U.S. tax law. So today, the Secretary of Treasury is up on Capitol Hill for his confirmation hearing, and he outlined the renewal of the U.S. tax cuts as the number one economic priority of the United States for the coming year. And so we thought we'd take a look at it and at what are the ramifications for the transatlantic relation or for our broader allied partners. And are there not only opportunities that could come out of this bill, but how do we also prevent potential future disputes or other issues from coming out? So we have arranged a fantastic panel today of experts to talk about the issues. I'm going to start with my co-conspirator in setting up today's event, Sean Bray. So Sean is the VP of Global Projects at the Tax Foundation and the Policy Director of Tax Foundation Europe. He is an alumni of both the U.S. Senate and the European Parliament, where he worked on tech, telecom, and trade policy. He is an alumni of the College of Europe, as well as the University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers. And he came in from Wisconsin, so he does not have a Washington bubble view only of the world. Thank you, Sean. Sean is going to give us an introduction of the tax bill, kind of an explainer, because we know that there are some here who may be new to the tax world. There may be some here that are not new to the tax world, so I apologize in advance. But he will be starting off and giving us that. And then we will have a panel discussion and moving into our other two experts. So Marjorie Chorlins is the Senior Vice President for Europe at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a very well-known figure in European circles in town, where she helps member companies with their trade and investment issues related to Europe, the UK, and the Ukraine. She's also a U.S. Senate and U.S. government alum and has spent time in companies such as Motorola and Lockheed Martin. And she's a Johns Hopkins SAIS and Wellesley alum. The other one. And last but not least is Kathleen Black, Senior Director for Global Tax Policy at Visa, also a U.S. Senate alum. And House. And has worked at Visa since 2021. Previously, she worked at Coca-Cola, which I think is where I first met you. And she's a George Washington alum. And just to clarify, Kathleen and Visa are in their quiet period in advance of making their earnings announcements. So I don't think Kathleen wants to get in front of her CEO on any market-moving items. So just a warning in case she can't answer any specific questions about Visa and specifically what they might be doing in terms of tax planning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean. He's going to do a little PowerPoint presentation, the love language of Washington, for all of us. And take it away, Sean.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. So when Penny and I first started talking about this event, one of the things we wanted to do was to bring the transatlantic community and the tax world together. That makes my job a little bit harder because explaining wonky tax stuff to transatlantic people or explaining transatlantic stuff to wonky tax people can be sometimes very difficult. So I'm going to try my best in this presentation to kind of set the scene of where I think the U.S. tax bill fits into the broader transatlantic relationship. So if I walk the line one way or the other, hopefully it's on the side of simple and easier to understand. So if you could hit the next slide, please. So this is the agenda I've set out. I'm going to try to set the scene, and I'm going to use our former TTIP negotiations. For those of you in the room who did trade, you'll be familiar with that. Some of the international tax developments to kind of set the scene of where we've been. I will talk a little bit about the U.S. tax reform and some ideas that candidate Trump had mentioned on the campaign trail. Obviously, we are yet to see exactly what he will start proposing next week. And then finally end on a slide of potentially transatlantic implications, how we might work together through some of these things or not. And then we'll go into our panel to discuss those in more detail. Next slide, please. So you can go ahead. So one thing I want to point out, these are kind of the three questions in my mind as I'm thinking through a lot of the U.S. tax reform policy ideas as it relates to Europe. And so these are the things that are going through my mind day to day. To what extent are we going to work together? I think that's a bigger and bigger question every day. 10 years ago, that was less of a question. Number two, and I will explain this a little bit more in detail as I go through, what does equivalence mean? So we have different standards and we have different expectations through our tax and trade and our standards. So what does equivalence mean, and who will be deciding on what equivalence means? I think those are really the three big kind of broad questions. Next slide, please. The point of this slide, we all know what's going on in the world, and I think we are somewhat fearful of the uncertainty of what will be to come. But the bottom of that slide is the most important part that I want to draw your attention to, which is the objectives of tax, trade, and setting standards are becoming even more and more connected than they used to be. They've always been connected, but I think in my world, they're becoming even more and more connected. So we will talk about all three of them kind of as a bundled package in this context. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start, and you can go to the next slide. I wanted to start just briefly talking about the legacy, in my opinion, of TTIP. TTIP was the now failed trade negotiation between the EU and the US. As it currently stands, we don't have a free trade agreement with Europe, but we tried under the Obama administration. And one of the kind of big points I want to point out about this, and why I think it's a helpful framework to see where we are and where we might be going, is one of the biggest concerns was that China was not playing by what we decided in the West was the rules-based order. And I think that's still relevant to this day. And TTIP was designed as the WTO was not necessarily serving its purpose anymore, or it was not effective to be able to serve its purpose anymore. TTIP was somewhat designed to put USTR and the European Commission kind of back in control of enforcing trade. And so I think that's one thing that I want to point out here is we did actually attempt to do something like this, and this was one of the kind of allied solutions to working together on the quote-unquote China question as it relates to trade. Next slide, please. So why did TTIP fail? I think there's many reasons, but one of them was the European citizens were quite worried about a quote-unquote race to the bottom of what they saw as their standards being dragged down by the compromising with American standards. Competition, of course, was a consideration for many key constituencies in France and Germany and other places. I think it was hard for EU policymakers to gather public support. And frankly, a lot of it came from the mistrust of the American corporate community. And obviously, President Trump was elected and completely changed our trade policy direction. So one of the things I like to point out and this, to be frank, this has been going on for much longer than TTIP, but I think I will just say this since TTIP, because it's an easier framework to work within. The two main things that the EU has tried to do in its trade strategy since TTIP is enshrine higher standards in European law so that they could say to their public, look, we've got our high standards in law, now we can go to the table and negotiate. And the second was to design financial incentives or penalties, depending on how you look at it, on U.S. firms to push back, basically for the corporate sector to go to the U.S. government and say, hey, we're being fined, or we're being, the EU is taxing us, or they're putting fines on us. We'd like you to go work with Europe, sit down again with them and work with them. Some of the takeaways from this strategy, I think, is that it increases support for protectionist policies because there's a different agenda. It's not just about reducing tariffs and quotas and making everything free trade, but there's other aspects to this. The Brussels effect, of course, for those of you in the EU world know very well about the Brussels effect. And I think a third thing is that it's been very difficult under this strategy to balance some of the American and Chinese demands. We've seen that very recently with Chinese EVs and how Europe might go on tariffs or not. And so that's been one of the difficulties under this new strategy. So that's what's been going on trade. That's part of the picture. I'll talk a little bit about the international tax world. So BEPS 1.0 was essentially an action item plan of 15 items. It was run through the OECD. And without making it too complicated, what they were trying to do is coordinate across the OECD countries, and then what became a larger group of countries around the world to coordinate various tax policy options to limit global profit shifting. And that was one of the main objectives. Most of these things have been worked on for quite a while. Some have been more successful than others. But the big point of saying this is that while the trade conversation has kind of been talked about as the Chinese are not playing by the world trade rules, kind of the underlying tone of the BEPS project was, well, American M&Es are profit shifting. They're not really playing by the rules as we want them to be. Of course, these things can all be disputed, but that was kind of the sentiment, at least from the European perspective, of why they were so engaged in this. Base erosion and profit shifting. Thank you. Thanks, Penny. So a lot of these things have been worked on. One of the big questions was how to tax the digital economy. How do we stop profit shifting? These were some of the big questions that were trying to be answered at the OECD. Coming out of the BEPS 1.0 project, BEPS 2.0 came along. Some of the action items from the original project were not completed, so they became part of a second project. Some of you have probably heard Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Even if you don't know what they are, you've probably at least heard that. Pillar 2 is a 15% global minimum tax for M&Es over a certain threshold. And Pillar 1 is designed to essentially redistribute profits to different countries. That's the simplest way of saying that. As it stands right now, this was supposed to be negotiated and adopted by the OECD countries and part of the globe group of countries, which is quite a large number. The United States is part of that group and committed to implementing these things. I should say the executive branch committed to these things. Congress had a different opinion. So the United States has not adopted Pillar 2 or Pillar 1. The EU has adopted Pillar 2, which means Pillar 2 exists in European law throughout all 27 member states. But the US and China have not adopted that. And one of the big questions in the tax world these days is Pillar 1 going to survive or not? And essentially the Europeans have said, if not, then we're going to kind of re-implement our digital services taxes, which Americans didn't like to start. Next slide, please. So the reason I went through that is because I think it's important to see how tax and trade over the last 10 to 15 years have worked together, where we've tried a coordinating strategy with the EU, even though it failed on trade. At the OECD, the United States has worked with other European countries and other governments from around the world to try and coordinate international tax policy with varying degrees of success. But what's interesting now is that Europe has implemented Pillar 2. The United States and the Chinese have not. Nobody's implemented Pillar 1, but the Europeans kind of have digital services taxes waiting in the wings to kind of reinstate if Pillar 1 doesn't go well. The Europeans have also created the policy of CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Coming from the wonky tax side of things, it's actually more of a tariff because there's no actual border adjustment. But in any case, they're trying to use CBAM to get the U.S. back to the table to negotiate on carbon pricing. And the Europeans have worked a lot on standards, as I mentioned, kind of the GDPR, which is the privacy standard in Europe, et cetera. The two main takeaways that I want everyone to kind of have in their mind before we talk about the U.S. tax bill is what will the EU's political willingness be to use these measures? So these are in European law, and they could be using them as they wish. But if they do, the American government or other governments around the world who don't have these things and are facing the fines or penalties for not having these things, they may retaliate in various economic ways. And so kind of the rationale for Europe is, okay, these are in our laws. We could enforce these things on US or Chinese or any other company operating in the EU, but that might invite some retaliation from the United States or the other governments. Is that worth it? So next slide, please. Next slide. So the reason I want to lay that out is because that's the kind of transatlantic picture when it comes to tax and trade that we are now operating in as the US. When we're thinking through our tax reform, these are the things that we are considering. The Europeans are sitting across the table saying, hey, we all said we were going to do Pillar 2. Europe's done Pillar 2. We're waiting for you to do Pillar 2. We've all agreed to do Pillar 1. Seems like you guys are not interested in Pillar 1. We took carbon pricing very seriously with CBAM, and we're waiting for you to hop on So the U.S. tax reform, we had a tax reform in 2017 called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It made the United States corporate income tax more competitive, lowered the rate down to 21%. And there were also some international changes. I mean, it was a huge bill, but the ones that are relevant here, there are some international changes, namely GILTI, FDII, and BEAT. Those are the three kind of big pieces of our international changes. And essentially, without getting wonky, they were designed to try to limit profit shifting. And it was the first minimum tax on companies. Let's put it that way. So it was the first minimum tax before Pillar 2 even came along. The United States had their own version of a minimum tax that was passed in 2017. I understand you cannot read this. It's not meant to be read. What's meant to be shown here is that the reason we're talking about tax reform in 2025 is because, as you can see, there's many bullet points on this list. These are all the things that are changing from TCJ. So it was not a permanent, some things were not permanent in the tax change. There were a lot of expiring or temporary provisions. And the bullet points kind of just show all the various things that will be changing. And this year, most of them happen to be expiring or changing at the end of this year. There were some things that are already expired or changed, but a majority of them are coming at the end of this year. The reason I say that is to motivate why we are even doing U.S. tax reform this year. That's why it's such a big topic, because if these things were to expire, we'd go back to a pre-2017 tax world in the United States. Okay, so these are some of the campaign ideas. I could have updated this daily based on whatever thing has been tweeted, but for now, we're just sticking to this. I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the ideas that came out of the Trump campaign and some of the things to be looking for as we start negotiating next week on some of these things. Obviously, the tariffs are part of, they're not a tax, but it is a tax. It has the incidence of a tax. So we talk about tariffs. One of the big things that has also come around is Trump has mentioned lowering the corporate income tax rate yet again to as low as 15%. The reason I wanted to point that out is because we know that investment is driven in large part by the corporate tax rate. And the lower the United States goes, the more competitive the United States could be for investment vis-a-vis Europe. So I think for a transatlantic community, it's important to watch that and understand that that might be driving even more investment from Europe to the United States, or put more pressure on Europe to make a better deal within Europe. Next slide, please. On Pillar 2, so on the global minimum tax, Europe has it. There's a mechanism within Pillar 2 that if other countries don't adopt it, that European countries can start to tax the piece that the other countries are not taxing. So just give a very simple, relevant example. If an American company is operating in Europe and it's determined under the big formula that those companies are only paying 10% on their profits, based on where that company is operating in Europe, those countries might be able to say, well, you're supposed to be paying 15, you're only paying 10. We're going to take that extra 5 and we're going to bring it here to Germany or France or whichever country it is. So that's, in very simple terms, that's why Pillar 2 has been such a big deal. It's supposed to essentially stop profit shifting or at least make companies pay a certain amount of money. The problem is that the U.S. government gives certain tax credits to U.S. companies that reduce their rate. And the way that the Pillar 2 formula, the big formula works, is that it doesn't necessarily incorporate some of those things. So a company might say, well, we were paying 15, we got a 5% reduction from the U.S. government. So yes, we're only paying 10, but it was because we got a reduction from the government. And another country in Europe might say, well, we don't care. It's not part of Pillar 2. We're still going to take that 5% anyway. And so you could see how that might cause some issues for the U.S. government, because they say, well, we're actually trying to incentivize certain things from businesses, and the European governments are instead taking that money to their treasury instead. So that's why Pillar 2 has been such a big kind of contention. And so the big question now is, what will the United States do on Pillar 2? Will we implement something like that here in our tax reform, or will we not? Here are some of the options we could do. The do-nothing approach, which is we just keep our laws the way they are, and we don't do anything. The second option is GILTI, which I mentioned was under the TCJ reform, was our minimum tax policy. And we could try to find a way to make GILTI and our refundable tax credits look something more like Pillar 2. It probably wouldn't be exactly the same, but maybe it's close enough. And here we are at the question of equivalency. How close would we have to get to the Pillar 2 template for Europe to say, okay, it's close enough, no problem. The third option is to just adopt Pillar 2 outright, which I don't think is going to happen, but that's an option. And then, of course, we don't have any issues of top-up taxes or other governments taking what might be considered the U.S. tax base. And the fourth option, which I've had to add since the election, is the do nothing and retaliate approach, which is Chairman Smith in the House has said this many times. They took a trip, I think it was last year, to the OECD, essentially in 2023, essentially saying, if we come into power, we're not going to do Pillar 2. And oh, by the way, if you start taxing our companies more under Pillar 2, we're going to retaliate. And so that option has become what seemingly is more likely at this point. Next slide, please. I just want to put some numbers in your head. The basic number is that these tax reform ideas for the United States will cost about $4 trillion. The reason I think that's important is because the tariff revenue we've calculated would bring in about $79 billion. There's a big difference between billions and trillions. And so they will not pay for the tax cuts. That's what I'm trying to say. But I just wanted to show you we have numbers on this. If you're interested, we certainly have the resources to show you. Next slide, please. So just to leave you with some takeaways from the U.S. tax reform, we will have a tax reform one way or the other. It's essentially required because of all the temporary provisions in the TCJ. The 15% rate would make the U.S. more competitive than Europe and more competitive than a lot of places around the world for investment, and that's something that our allies and partners should be thinking about. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 look just highly unlikely, in my opinion. Maybe I'll be wrong, but it doesn't seem like the current leadership is interested in going down that path. And in fact, retaliation would be on the table instead. And finally, I don't think I have to say it to this group, but tariffs are not going away, and they'll, in fact, probably be even more prevalent this time around. So the last two slides, I will leave you, and hopefully is a nice segue into our panel here. The first is, what could a TTIP 2.0 look like? If the United States and Europe actually wanted to work together, what could we do? In my opinion, the best thing to do would be to reform the WTO. The worst thing to do is have a trade war between us and not work together at all. In between, there are various options, which we have kind of oscillated between over the years. So the big question is, to what extent will we work together, and who decides in Europe and in the United States? Who's going to make those calls about what we're going to give up, what if we're going to retaliate or not, what kind of tariff retaliation or not should we have? These are really big questions, and it's not clear to me, even in the United States, who's making those calls. Obviously, in Europe, it's a much more complicated situation. I'll leave it on a positive note, even if next week might prove me very wrong. This might age terribly. But we could have peace through equivalency, and that would be my preference. On tax, we could find a way to work together on Pillar 2. Even if we don't adopt Pillar 2 here in the United States, there might be ways that we can get close enough and have an equivalency so that European governments are not taxing U.S. companies basically for what the U.S. government has given them. We could also have a safe harbor, which essentially does the same thing. Pillar 1, honestly, I don't have a great answer, but I don't think we're going to do Pillar 1, and it's up to the Europeans to decide if they're going to kind of bring back the digital services taxes or not that Pillar 1 was designed to stop. On CBM, Senator Cassidy currently has a bill that looks sort of kind of like CBM. We might be able to work on something like that, where we set out a list of carbon pricing industries that we're willing to price at a similar rate, and we don't have CBAM penalties against importing countries into the EU. And on tariffs, it could obviously go one of two ways. It could either be, well, it's a strategic play and we kind of work it out. Maybe that's sort of what we did the first time around, or it could just be an all-out trade war and we don't have any response to it. So I'll just leave that here. I think there are, the takeaway is that there are ways to work together. The question will just be who decides and if we want to or not. So thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks. Lots of food for thought there in terms of what's coming and where some of the focus will be. in the upcoming. So I want to turn to Marjorie, maybe kind of in some sense to react to some of what Sean has put out there. I mean, why is it important that we try to work together from a transatlantic perspective? I mean, I know you work every day with people that have jobs, investment, subsidiary income, et cetera, that goes back and forth across the Atlantic. But I'd just be curious for how do you think about with the Trump administration and others who may not have the reflex to automatically work with the transatlantic community, why is it important for Americans that we think about our transatlantic partners and the transatlantic relationship as we navigate some of these big tax laws?
Great. Thanks, Penny, and thanks for inviting me to join you today. It's great to see familiar faces in the audience. Look, the U.S., I'm going to talk about the U.S.-EU relationship. The U.S.-European writ large relationship is this much bigger than what I'm about to tell you. And that is that the U.S.-EU commercial relationship is an $8 trillion relationship. It generates, we estimate, at least 16 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's a huge relationship. Europe is indeed our largest commercial trade partner. We are Europe's largest commercial trade partner, notwithstanding what Europeans may say about China being a largest trading partner. When you look overall, the relationship really is the largest with the U.S. The key here is that of that $8 trillion, the lion's share of that is in two-way foreign direct investment. European companies have invested in every single state of the United States. I jotted down just a couple of stats just to underscore this, right? So obviously states like Texas and California, New York, big investments, lots of jobs. Even in Little Wyoming, where the fewest people are employed directly tied to European foreign direct investment, it's 2,500 people. In Montana, which receives the least amount of foreign direct investment from the EU, it's $1 billion. And that accounts for 3,700 jobs. So if you're looking all across the country, including, I should say, in the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, there are investments. If you're looking across the country, if you're a farm state senator or you're a Rust Belt state senator, you care a heck of a lot about jobs and you care a heck of a lot about exports. And so the idea that we're going to use tax and trade policy to try to effect change in Europe's behavior is not something that every member of Congress is really going to be comfortable with. I think that right now there is obviously a clear indication that folks are lining up behind the president-elect. But I think when push comes to shove and we actually have to talk about implementing some of these policies, it won't be as straightforward as people might think. I think the other thing that I would say is the supply chain interconnectedness between the U.S. and Europe cannot be overstated. It is extraordinary. Goods go back and forth every single day. And both sides benefit from that supply chain connection. I think that American companies continue to look at Europe as the most significant market outside the United States, with the possible exception of China. But I will say increasingly American companies are looking at what's happening in Europe, but Sean alluded to some of this, and questioning whether their investments in Europe, when it comes to investing their next dollar, whether that next dollar is going to be invested in Europe or it's going to be invested someplace else. There are lots of reasons for that, chief among them being the very far-reaching regulatory structures that exist in Europe at the EU level. and at the member state level. But that's only one of the factors I think that kicks in here. Is there room for the U.S. and Europe to, come together on some of these things? I would love to think the answer is yes. There will not be a TTIP 2.0. I can tell you that for the fact, right? Michelangelo, I think that's a fair assessment. Not breaking news, exactly. There are ways that we can and we should be working together. I just don't think it's going to be easy right out of the gate. I think the one mitigating circumstance here is that notion that there are farm state senators and Rust Belt senators and members of Congress for whom tariffs on U.S. imports and, more importantly, European retaliatory measures that impact U.S. exports will be thinking twice about it. And many of those lawmakers are wearing two hats. They're wearing the tax hat and the trade hat, if you look at folks, for example, in the Senate Finance Committee. So complicated, but from a commercial standpoint, the relationship is pretty fundamental.
Thank you, Marjorie. So, Kathleen, from a company perspective, and we've had a discussion. I came out of a corporate environment. Tax was kind of the foundation upon which our corporate strategies were sometimes woven. They weren't always definitive. They were part of a broader equation, but tax usually was the cutting edge, and then everything else got kind of hung or built on top of it. So I'd just be curious all of us have probably used our credit cards with Visa on both sides of the Atlantic at one point in time. So would love to just hear your perspectives. I know you have a lot of experience in different corporate environments on this, but to hear kind of how you all are thinking about the tax issues and then the transatlantic implications.
Yeah. So again, thanks. Really great. I love doing this. Thank you all for being here. The state of play right now is remarkably similar to where we were 4 years ago when Trump left office. If you had gone to sleep 4 years ago and woke up today and said, what's happening on a global minimum tax? Trump had walked away from the negotiating table. The thing in the global minimum tax that has truly transpired, and I wouldn't have bet on it 4 years ago, was that countries have implemented their own domestic 15% corporate minimum tax. That's part of an EU directive. So everybody in the EU was on board to make that happen. 4 years ago, I would not have bet that Ireland would have signed on, or Hungary, but both did. Both are going to 15. As Sean had mentioned, not only is China not on board, a pretty major economy, India is also not on board. The United States has had our GILTI tax, hate that acronym, but the U.S. has had our global minimum tax in effect since the 2017 bill was written into law. And the U.S., for all of these years since, has said, come on in, rest of the world. The water's fine. We have a tax. Come join us. And the rest of the world is now doing that. And neither the incoming Trump administration or Republicans in Congress, who will have the levers of government, have any problem, truly, with any government imposing a domestic tax on earnings inside their own borders. Where they got a problem is when any country reaches outside of their own borders to an extraterritorial tax that says, you're not taxing enough, I get to top up tax you. And it's there where the United States will have some retaliation if that happens. And there's a couple of bills that have been very broadly broadcast, introduced, talked about, foot stomping across the OECD office is in Paris with French officials in Paris and with Germans in Berlin by members of the Ways and Means Committee when they were not holding the reins of power. But now they are, and they have been. And they have been very clear about broadcasting. Like, you can do anything you want in your own territory, but don't come into mine and recoup particularly the R&D credits. Somehow, uniquely, in American law, R&D credits, and there's some weird financial accounting reasons why this is the way it is, but American R&D credits would be uniquely subject to being recouped by a foreign government. And if as an American company, your R&D credit were to take you below a 15% rate. Now, apparently, if you have an R&D incentive in any of the EU directive countries, that's perfectly fine because it's a different mechanism under financial accounting rules. I find that really hard to believe, but apparently our U.S. negotiators at the table didn't understand the difference between financial accounting and tax accounting when that was all negotiated. So it is what it is. But again, 4 years ago, Trump had walked away from the negotiating table saying, you are not going to enforce on my American companies. And so he's walking back into office with what will be foreign governments' threats to recoup American incentives. I don't see U.S. taxpayers backing down on, or U.S. members of Congress backing down on that one. There's not that many things that are sacrosanct in Congress, but bipartisan, they do love their R&D credit. There was an op-ed written Monday or Tuesday of this week by Congressman Ron Estes of Kansas. In the op-ed was in the Telegraph, a British paper, basically saying you can do anything you want in your own borders, but don't come after my companies, and that we will retaliate. So that's one of the things. My company, we have operated very publicly in a country like Singapore that has very famously had a low rate, and they are bringing their rate up. So again, that is a tax they will be imposing. Them and Ireland and Romania, all of these countries, Hungary, will be raising their rates up to 15, with the exception of a couple of big economies, China and India. There are countries right now that are collecting that 15% rate and are now saying, we're collecting money we really had not budgeted to collect. How can we get out there and share with you some incentive money? Because it's not an illegal tax incentive. No. This is a grant. And somehow now, instead of competition based upon tax issues, there is going to be competition based upon refunded grants. I kind of don't get the point of the whole exercise at that point. But one thing that is important for all of us with US-EU relationships is that the EU also has a whole other new system in place that's been in operation called the Foreign Subsidy Regulation. I think it was mostly intended to try to get at Chinese incentives that are hard to understand or see. They're not necessarily transparent. But the EU will be now also arbitrating what is an approvable subsidy in these cashback programs, to use a credit card analogy. So how the U.S. deals with perhaps getting our U.S. guilty tax to be a equivalency system is probably on the table. There's a lot of Republicans who are very populist these days. This isn't your grandfather's, country club Republican team anymore. And the guilty tax rate, let's call it 13.125%. I find it hard to believe that particularly the populist Republicans are going to be okay with American big companies, corporations, paying 13.125 instead of 15, which is where the rest of the world is. My guess at the end of the day is you'll see guilty go up to a 15% rate all in. Is that enough to then make the U.S. an equivalency? We'll see. There's a lot of potholes between now and getting a tax bill enacted into law. Another very important piece of the global minimum tax at 15 and having the U.S. get equivalency is the question of country by country equivalency versus one big basket for all of your global earnings. Again, I don't see a lot of populists in Congress say, I'm okay if you can pick and choose. But when you look at it, if everybody in the world, including the Irelands and the Singapores and the Switzerlands, are coming up to 15, we're going to be paying 15 anyway. So is raising guilty to 15 that big a deal? Probably not.
Yeah, Sean, and then I'm going to, you guys start preparing your own questions because I'll turn to all of you. But Sean, if you have a reaction to that, but also I want to talk a little bit about, some of the other things some of the other potholes that we've talked about. So that could come up between the United States and Europe and some of our other allies, which are the opportunities we have on carbon tax, on sales tax, digital sales taxes, service taxes. Canada's also got that out there. Those seem to me to be like glass half full. We have opportunities there. But Sean, you wanted to react?
Yeah. So just to point out, the top-up tax mechanism within Pillar 2, which allows other governments to essentially tax U.S. companies on the U.S. tax base, that's actually a feature, not a bug of Pillar 2. What it's designed to do is cause a domino effect. So the idea was, well, if Germany is going to come and say, okay, Visa or whoever, we're going to tax the extra 5%, that Visa would go to the U.S. government and say, hey, guys, we got to do this Pillar 2 thing because I don't want to keep getting taxed by Germany, and that seems unfair. And so the whole idea was once Europe got Pillar 2 implemented, it would sort of start a domino effect around the world of other countries saying, well, companies get taxed by other countries, so we should do Pillar 2 as well. And that was supposed to be the incentive. The problem is, in my opinion, that only works in a globalized world where being an ally or being a partner is the priority. When the response is essentially, well, we're just going to retaliate, that's not much of a domino effect happening, right? So you end up with Europe just having this law and trying to essentially negotiate with other countries to say, hey, you guys should also do this. And those countries just saying, no, thank you. And so I just think it's worth pointing out that Pillar 2 is actually designed to be that way. For as much as the Republicans in Congress have said, we don't want this. And that's why they're so against it, because it's not just like this thing came out of nowhere. It was purposely put in, designed to work that way. But I think it leads to a broader question, which is kind of why I mentioned TTIP, because under the TTIP logic, I'll put it that way, the idea was we need to work with our partners and allies to create standards and create kind of a larger market of our allies and partners, and use that power and our markets to force other countries to change their rules. The prerogative was not only driving investment and increasing goods and services across the Atlantic, but it was also about saying to China and other countries, look, if you're going to trade with Europe and the United States, you've got to do these things. You can't be paying 2 cents a year and to children. You actually need to follow labor standards. You need to follow all kinds of regulations. And that was supposed to help both of our markets kind of succeed in a globalized world. And if all else failed, at least we had our, what did you say, $16 trillion market together that we could, 8 trillion. Okay. By then it would have been 16 that we could rely on. So that was the logic of TTIP, was let's work together to harmonize our standards, at least to some equivalency level transatlantically, and then use our power to make everybody else play by those rules. At this point, that partnership, the more that partnership gets strained or pulled apart, now it's just, okay, the US, we're going to use our market and do the same thing, or Europe's going to use their market and do the same thing. And so it begs a bigger question, which is, strategically, how should the United States use its tax and trade and standard policies to either work with or work against its partners and allies? And so I think that's where we come to this kind of carbon club idea, or this, pillar 2 idea, these ideas where we can go industry by industry. And that's kind of what the Tech and Trade Council was trying to do this time around. Rather than having a huge free trade agreement, let's just pick out specific sectors like AI or something critical and come up with standards there. Or there's the alternative, which is we're just not going to work together on these things, and it's you versus us, and we're just going to see who wins.
So one thing for me that's kind of interesting about the tax issue versus the tariff issues, tariff applies to goods. Taxes applies to goods and services. So, in all of these discussions, the tax way is the way you get at the service industries, potentially. Maybe in a different way. But when you have the digital sales tax, which is, how do you think about replacing industrial bases and tax bases in cities that are losing their manufacturing capabilities because they used to make CDs or VCR cassette tapes, or now it's all done digitally. So cities are having to think through where do we get tax revenue in a world that's becoming more and more digitalized and less manufactured good. And so I think that some of what Europe is doing is going to be a very interesting question that everyone's going to have to grapple with. For me, it seems like an issue that the U.S. will need to grapple with as well someday, with certain cities and localities being hollowed out. And then and with AI coming, how do you think about that tax base? It's probably a tax bill too early for that conversation, and so it will end up being a trade irritant. But I was just curious about that one as well.
So again, if you had gone to sleep 4 years ago, there were a handful of European countries and some others, but Spain, France, Austria, and the UK, and Italy had put in place digital services taxes. All of that got put on hold. They're in effect, and Trump, right? Well, they are collecting. Trump had put on retaliatory tariffs. One of the first things Biden did was take those off and say, you can collect those tariffs or those DSTs until we get Pillar 1 done. And Pillar 1 is now dead. The OECD staff put out an update that was a very nice eulogy for Pillar 1. And I like to quote from The Wizard of Oz, and I want to read specifically the quote. Not only merely dead, it's really mostly sincerely dead. That Pillar 1 is done. And we are now back at a point where there is a group of European countries perhaps facing Donald Trump's retaliatory tariffs again.
Yeah. It's not just a handful. It's just a handful of European member states who have had DSTs on the books. It is, Europe writ large, in addition to the individual member states, everybody's looking around for revenue.
Yep.
We're all looking around for revenue. Europe needs more revenue, which is why they've considered a digital tax at the European level, but that hasn't gone anywhere yet. But the challenge is,
too, and just as a reminder, a part of the Pillar 1 Global Minimum Tax Directive was not legally tied to doing so the Pillar 2 directive was not legally tied to Pillar 1, that it was a strong political connection. That if you're going to do this minimum tax, we're also going to have this reallocating, call it digital tax sort of a thing. Now that Pillar 1 is done, DSTs are back, and the rest of the European countries are saying, what about me? And a lot of EC staff are saying, we could use that for own resources to pay for COVID relief.
So I'm just going to look at the audience and see if there's any initial questions from folks in the audience. Yeah, Peter.
Peter Letke with Allianz. It's more an observation than anything else. What's has, of course, is it is money, and you should quantify it. And in other international proceedings, we had similar parallel to speak. So I'll give you one, because I'm in the insurance business. And you have the whole idea of insurance capital standards, which the Europeans wanted, and they were trying to say that any country that does not comply or have equivalence is no longer going to be allowed into Europe and so on. Now, we have our own system in the United States, the solvency protection. You're both good systems. And I could point fingers at both of them because it's that rise financial. You can sure say provided these could be changed, but it works. Ultimately, what happened at the end, just probably with the threat of retaliation from the European Union, an agreement was reached, not because anybody really cared, and frankly, nobody should have cared because as I said, well, this is a pretty success. But there were other components, and that were foreign policy and other places. We did need to be at war with each other over something. It's relatively, in the scheme of life, insignificant when you've got bigger threats, whether that's Russia or other things or climate change and so forth. For God's sakes, pull it in and get professional. And I end up acquiescing that the U.S. is equivalent, which it is. So now, could something like that possibly occur in the Chesapeake, or is it because it's financial, it's an allocation of a collective pot? Does that make it a possibility?
In my opinion, it's possible if you are focused on the outcome. So if the outcome is a certain country or a certain company is paying 15%, however you get there with refundable, non-refundable, this, that, or the other, or a certain band. So let's say within 2% of 15% or something, as Kathleen mentioned, GILTI currently is at 13.125. It's a political decision ultimately. And that's why I think it is financial and it is quantifiable. But at the end of the day, it's who's deciding that political question of maybe it's not exactly the same, but the priority is working together rather than getting that extra whatever percent. And that's where I think the question is for all of these things, for carbon taxation, for corporate minimum tax, for digital services. All these things are ultimately political decisions. And it's just basically coming down to, do we decide to work together, or is the U.S. going to use its market on its own and everybody else do what it wants, and Europe the other way around? But it is technically possible to find equivalencies.
Yeah. President Trump is very focused on fairness and reciprocity. So I would assume that that's a guiding principle in this area as well. Other questions? Anyone else? Yeah, Michelangelo.
There was also a campaign book, if I'm not mistaken, from Trump campaign at some point that the tax cuts, the corporate tax cuts, the additional ones, would only be available for those who produce within the U.S. Or let's say the ones that produce outside would be somehow penalized. I can't get my head around how he would do that and everything you described right now. Can you give us a sense of how that would work? Would it be a GILTI type of thing? Would it be something else? How would that work?
So I think most of the time that I heard him speak this, it was, and I'm going to condense several data points, probably some sort of a rate reduction for domestic producers. Old school, before the 2017 law, there was a provision in law, Section 199, that was effectively that. It was a 3% rate differential. It took a lot of calculating to get there, but that's what it effectively was. The business community found it so onerous to deal with that in 2017, we all pushed that back onto the table and said, just overall reduce the rate. Keep it simple and don't make us go through all of these gyrations to do that. I've also heard, as a services company, I certainly heard numerous times in his speaking about this, him talk about a manufacturer's incentive, and sometimes it was a producer's incentive. And Visa is not a manufacturer, so I tracked that one very closely. And I don't know what that would be, but it's useful to know that the business community in general in 2017 said, it's too complicated. Just give us, we'll push this one onto the table and help buy down our rate.
Other thoughts? Other questions?
So, Kathy, you mentioned in your speech your gut instinct that guilties can be raised to 50% to align with the voter. You go deeper into that. What's your justification? Is now we're just playing with the margins, like Dow had. It's going to raise much funds. So,
What does guilty stand for, Lynn?
Global low tax intangible income.
And so this is mainly to go after people with like large IP values, so pharmaceuticals,
Again,
IT companies, etc.
Pre-2017, in a world when we had a lot of inversions and companies moving their IP assets abroad, where Ireland had a lower tax rate. It was very attractive. The two major shifts were to implement a global tax called GILTI, and then also, so that was the stick, and the carrot part that was an equal and opposite attraction was that if you had your IP, if you had your IP in the US, you got a lower tax rate on it. And that provision's nicknamed FDII, foreign derived intangible income. That provision has caused a lot of very high profile American companies to move their crown jewels, their intellectual property into the United States, giving the United States the first right to tax that very valuable income stream.
As opposed to Ireland. Ireland used to get it, and sometimes Luxembourg.
Absolutely. And so now both of those rates are lower than 15. And I think at the time, again, 4 years ago, 2017, I would not have predicted that Ireland would have gone to 15. They were at 12 and a half. Any man on the street in Dublin you could have talked to him and said, what's the corporate tax rate? And they would say 12.5%. And we're proud of it because they saw all of these global companies with major job bases in their country, in their city. So in 2017, Congress said 13.125, which was kind of competitive with Ireland. Jump forward to 2025, the global rate ended up being 15. American companies have still had 13.125 as our basic rate for all of these years up to now. America is grandfathered with our current system through the end of the year. I think all of us in the business community are asking for keep the rate competitive. I just find it hard to believe that a lot of populists in the Republican Party in particular are going to be okay with us having a rate that's less than where the rest of the world is.
Yeah, it's leaving money on the table, right?
It is. Well, it's less about the fear that they're going to come in and use these top-up taxes and take money out than why would we don't need this incentive on 13.125 anymore. It's my gut feeling. It's just that they'll go to 15. on that one. And in law, here's the weirder part of this. The rate when Congress wrote this the rate was supposed to go up to 16% in current law. Is at the end of this year, our corporate rate is supposed to go up to 16. I think it's 16.4.
Remember those bullet points up there? It was on there.
It was one of them. I did not see
I swear it was on.
Yeah. So if you use a current law baseline, you're going to both make American companies happy that we're not going to see our GILTI go up to 16.4. It's only going to go to 15 if there's some political budget magic about baselines. I can't go into it here. But if instead they only go up to 15, they can collect revenue and make us happy that it's not 16.4. Ta-da!
So we're coming up to the end, but I'll take one last question, Parker. Unless there's another question, I'll take one more. Okay, I'll take Parker then.
Thanks so much. Been very interesting. Touched a little bit on the geopolitics of tariffs at the very beginning, but do you feel like if common ground can be found, at least partially, on the tax question, can this buy goodwill for other cooperation? I've seen some head shaking.
Yeah.
Like,
We are transactional right now.
Well, yeah, the incoming president is hugely transactional, but it's also you have to bear in mind the relationship between the U.S. and Europe has been bumpy for quite some time. It's not unique to when Trump came into office in 2016. This goes back a ways. And we've gone through successive cycles. I mean, John talked about TTIP as an example, but the Biden administration kind of came kicking and screaming to the table for TTIP. So sorry, not Biden, the Obama administration came kicking and screaming to the table. We've had our differences. We will continue to have our differences. When President Biden came into office, he sort of helped to put on ice a couple of big disputes, right? One around large civil aircraft and the other around the steel and aluminum tariffs. But they're still there. And we have substantial differences on a number of issues. It's just, I think the thing to keep in mind here is to, even as we're focusing on tax policy here today, the factors that go into the transatlantic relationship are multifaceted, right? Tax, trade, geopolitical, the whole thing, climate, et cetera, et cetera. So just because there might be some ground for coalescence, if you will, on tax, I don't think that necessarily mitigates the differences that exist on trade. And I honestly think the real question is to what extent the president-elect's known antipathy towards Europe, or specifically towards the construct of the EU, will color policy going forward. Is it just something he kind of can't see past? In which case, we're going to continue to have friction. There'll be friction no matter what. There'll be friction in part because American companies are complaining more loudly than ever about regulation in Europe. And this administration, unlike the current administration, this incoming administration, is likely to be more receptive to those concerns. So there's going to be friction. How much of that is just driven by the president-elect's own, visceral reaction, and what sort of flexibility that might give policymakers in the administration, I think nobody knows for sure.
I think one way I would answer that as well as she was just mentioning, the tax was not as much of part of that matrix then as it is now. Like 10 years ago, it was defense, energy, carbon, trade. Tax was there, but it wasn't. There wasn't this pillar 2 global minimum. Like that wasn't part of the equation, and now it is. So it's certainly not the only thing, but now it's kind of a added piece to the puzzle, if you will.
I mean, again, the focus here is on U.S. tax law because it's a big thing that's on the horizon. But you also can't look past the fact that Europe has its own issues that it's struggling with right now around competitiveness.
The Draghi report.
The Draghi report is a great sort of descriptor of the many challenges that Europe faces. Shammer did a similar report, not nearly as in depth. But Europe has its own challenges it needs to sort out. It has its own domestic political constituencies. It has European countries across the board have seen the rise in populist parties in a number of key places, and so the pressures that they're going to be under to respond to populist pressure, not to fold to the U.S., for example, that's going to be real. So I fear we're going to end up having more conflict than we might otherwise have, because the noise around the relationship is kind of drowning out better judgment. Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah, so I'm Masati Bashams. My question is around that. And I recognize the various discussions around those beatness framework and various concerns here in the US around that. I'm interested to know from a business perspective and what do you especially to within the company in particular businesses on the increase of the compliance costs for not complying or what might happen in there's a dead and there are various retaliatory measures and the increased cost of that, and if businesses actually would prefer the deal to just be signed versus everything that come up if it's not.
So there are crazy compliance costs for the global minimum tax. My company's effective tax rate, published all over the place, I can say this out loud, is 17.4%. To prove that our rate exceeds 15%, everybody here could do that math. 17.4 is more than 15, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of compliance costs to prove that our rate is above 15. There had been hope for a safe harbor from all of this, because if you can do the math, that 17.4 is more than 15. And, pretty much everywhere we do business, the rate's being increased to 15. So there's a lot of countries where 15% would be a great rate, and the countries' rates are a lot higher. So there is a huge amount of compliance costs, and I am befuddled. Why? Governments are okay with just insane amounts of compliance costs when it will generate zero additional revenue from so many businesses. So maybe one day governments, when they realize we're not actually collecting much more than around 15% here, this will get simplified, but that is unfortunately not on the horizon right now.
That's exactly the debate that's exactly the challenge that Europe is having to confront right now, because the compliance costs associated with implementing the sort of seemingly endless tsunami of regulations that come out of Europe are only growing by the day. One company that I'm aware of it's a $20 billion company, has told me that complying with one particular regulation in Europe, just one particular regulation that happens to be really important to their sector, is like $500 million for a $20 billion company for one regulation. I mean, that's crazy, right? So there is more U.S. pushback. In fact, there's European company pushback as well, because the compliance costs don't just rest on American companies. So I think the challenge that Europe has, though, is that they need the money. And a lot of money they get comes from fines for noncompliance. And this is a real problem, because there's a concern that some of these measures are being used specifically to generate revenue because compliance is not possible. So it's complicated. It's complicated.
So I want to, I know we're slightly over time. So what I'd love to do is thank our panelists for making tax interesting and
That was fun.
relevant. I think we could have gone on with a few more questions on that. But now everybody in the room knows who the experts are to contact for more details as we move through this. I think we really only touched the kind of the surface, but what I think we started today is the conversation around how some of these domestic things, whether it be European regulation or U.S. tax laws, have larger impacts that expand beyond domestic boundaries. And as the U.S. makes the tax law their top economic issue for 2025, it will, by extension, impact global competitiveness for companies that operate and have locations around the world and are making investment decisions and making day-to-day decisions about where to source, where to manufacture, where to sell, and become incredibly important for the competitiveness of countries, whether it be UK, EU, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, moving forward. So big round of applause for our panelists, Sean, Kathleen, and Marjorie. And our hope is to have another one of these conversations once we get more specifics about what the U.S. law is going to look like, and we can have more detailed conversations and granular discussions about exactly what it might look like and what its impacts might be. And what the tariffs are going to be. The administratability of the tariffs is another terminology I've heard about compliance costs. So there will be no shortage of topics to discuss starting next Monday. So in the transatlantic space. So thank you all again and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, Doug. Well done.